Well, hello there. Welcome to this installment of History at Home series, brought to you by the Oviedo Historical Society and the Oviedo Preservation Project. Even though our subject today will be Winter Springs and Winter Springs history. Well, to begin the Winter Springs history, of course, the prehistoric Indians were here first. Long before the Seminoles, there were pre-conquest indigenous cultures throughout Florida. But we have today only a vague idea which ones were dominant in what is now Winter Springs. The first Europeans in this area were probably Spanish trappers or explorers moving up the St. Johns River, but they left no written records. We do know that the John and William Bartram expedition of 1766 camped at Clifton Springs. That's Overlook Park today, just over here, about a mile. In 1766, the spring area had apparently always been in use by Indians. The terms of modern day land titles, much of what is now the Tuscaloosa development and the eastern part of Winter Springs, was made up originally from a Spanish land grant given to Don Philip Robert Young by Spain in 1815. That was his reward for his support of Spain during the War of 1812. The western part of Winter Springs was mostly another Spanish land grant to a man named Moses Levy. And when Florida was turned over to the U.S. in 1821, the 4,000 or so European settlers in Florida were all clustered around the coast. There were only about 300 or 400 scattered across the interior. They were mostly up in North Florida. In 1823, a treaty between the U.S. government and the Seminoles gave the Indians 5 million acres, including what is now Winter Springs. The Seminole Indian Wars lasted altogether from 1817 to 1858, fought over land, slavery, and Seminole sovereignty. And you know, the Seminoles to this day have not finalized peace with the U.S. One major result of the Seminole Wars was the establishment of many forts throughout Florida, followed naturally by some scattered settlements in the vicinity of those forts prior to the Civil War, although none were within what is actually now Winter Springs. The post-Civil War history of Winter Springs pretty much begins with Mr. George C. Brantley, who built a wharf, warehouse, and store on the south shore of Lake Jesup, right about here at the north end of Tuscaloosa Road. Years later, George Brantley was traveling in New York trying to get a railroad started here and died in 1878, so this wharf passed away. There were other wharves on the south shore of Lake Jesup to serve that growing community. There was White's Wharf, about 2 miles to the east of here, at Clifton Springs. There was Mitchell's Wharf, where the Black Hammock Fish Camp is now. And there was Solari's Wharf, located very near Mitchell's, but in deeper water. All those wharves on Lake Jesup came to be because the Lake Jesup was as far upriver as the paddle wheel steamboats of the day could travel. And we're talking here about the years 1865 to about 1885. The river became too shallow further up at Lake Harney and beyond, and the natural result of Lake Jesup being the southern terminus of river commerce meant that a cluster of settlements began to grow in this area, and it became known initially as the Lake Jesup community. And it grew without any real plan for the most part. One exception was a plan for a village to be called Tuscaloosa. That was drawn up in 1874, but it was never really developed. It would have been just about where the community of Tuscaloosa Trails is now. Now, there was one early settler in the area, Oliver Prince, who established a post office at Brantley's store in the 1870s and named it Tuscaloosa, telling the Postal Service he had at that time about 200 customers in the area. In the 20th century, the lands that became Winter Springs changed hands so many times in so many ways it's hard to keep track. At times, there were parts of what is now Winter Springs that have been known as Wagner and Clifton Springs and Tuscaloosa and G Hammock and White's Landing or just plain Lake Jessup community. Finally, in 1959, much of the area was incorporated as North Orlando by the Florida legislature. And that came from the North Orlando Company, which was instrumental in developing the community. However, North Orlando presents a problem of its own, so the city was renamed Winter Springs in 1972, a name that referenced the Winter Springs Development Company and its acquisition of land. Finally, we had a solidifying of a distinct identity. And there you have it for now. Hope you've enjoyed our little history. There is much more to the story, but we'll save that for another day. Thank you for being with us. Be well.